Hello, today is Tuesday, June 6, 2023. I'm Joe Schmidt from TC2, and this is Staying Connected. Back in November of 2021, we recorded the first of several podcasts about a dispute between the FCC and the FAA, the respective regulators for the communications industry and the aviation industry. The ongoing dispute revolves around the wireless carriers' use of C-band spectrum to deliver new 5G services and the aviation industry's use of nearby spectrum for a critical safety system, a radio altimeter. With summer travel starting to heat up, today we are going to provide another important update on the topic because, as I said, this dispute is ongoing and it could potentially impact your travel plans. I'm back with my guests from those previous podcasts, Steve Rosen, a partner at LB3, and David Lee, TC2's technical director. Hey guys, thanks for joining me again. So, Steve, what's the latest with this ongoing administrative law dust-up?
Joe, good to be back with you and Dave. Quite a bit has happened since our last podcast. First, in addition to Verizon Wireless and AT&T, which turned up 5G C-band service last November, there will be approximately 19 smaller wireless carriers providing 5G service in the United States beginning on July 1st, 2023. And these smaller carriers will be using spectrum at 3.8 to 3.98 gigahertz rather than the 3.7 to 3.98 gigahertz used by Verizon Wireless and AT&T in the initial deployment. Therefore, these new carriers will be transmitting on frequencies closer to the 4.2 to 4.4 gigahertz used by radio altimeters. In light of these proposed new deployments, on January 11th of this year, the FAA issued a proposed Airworthiness Directive, or AD, in which it specified which types of aircraft could land at which airports, assuming that 5G carriers continue to engage in mitigation efforts near airports. The bottom line from the proposed AD is that commercial aircraft must be 5G radio altimeter tolerant on or before July 1st to be allowed to access 5G CMAs. A 5G CMA stands for 5G C-band mitigated airport and is an airport at which the wireless carriers have agreed to voluntarily limit their 5G deployment at the request of the FAA. These CMAs constitute most of the large commercial airports in this country, and commercial aircraft must be 5G radio altimeter tolerant on or before February 1st, 2024, or they will not be able to operate in the national airspace system.
Wow, that is a lot to unpack. Okay, David, can you explain more about these mitigation efforts by the 5G carriers?
Absolutely, Joe. At certain commercial airports designated as these 5G CMAs, the wireless carriers have agreed to point their antennas away from the horizon, point them down. Also limit spurious or out-of-band emissions and reduce transmitter power so that the effective power density falls below certain thresholds at certain altitudes at or near airport runways. In fact, the FAA performed further assessments called Signal in Space, SIS analysis. This analysis provides a three-dimensional model for the runway safety zone and considers cellular base station heights and terrain around the airport. The FAA also reviewed various levels of interference tolerance for a majority of radio altimeters on the market, allowing them to understand the overall susceptibility to interference of the existing fleet of transport airplanes.
So, with that reduction in power, limiting spurious emissions, and antenna point down, are you saying, David, that all commercial aircraft will be able to access these 5G CMAs? What I mean is, can all planes land and take off at those airports?
No, not 100% at this time. The commercial aircraft fleet in the United States has been broken up into 4 groups of aircraft, depending upon the aircraft radio altimeter performance. As stated by the FAA, a non-radio altimeter tolerant airplane, also known in industry as a Group 1, 2, or 3 airplane, is one for which the radio altimeter, as installed, does not demonstrate the ability to operate or tolerate the current 5G spurious emissions and power levels. Some radio altimeters may already demonstrate tolerance to the 5G C-band emissions without modification, Some may need to install filters between the altimeter and the antenna to increase the altimeter's tolerance. For others, the addition of a filter will not be sufficient to address interference susceptibility. Therefore, the radio altimeter will need to be replaced with an upgraded altimeter. The FAA has determined that radio altimeter tolerant airplanes, these are called Group 4, will not experience the unsafe condition at any airport identified by the FAA as a 5G CMA. Most but not all of the Boeing, Airbus, and Embraer aircraft that form the backbone of the U.S. fleet meet or have been retrofitted to meet the new radio altimeter requirements.
So what will the airlines do with their non-radio altimeter tolerant airplane fleet?
Good question, Joe. Well, let's discuss the actual number of airplanes at issue. Based on the FAA's current information, there are approximately 8,000 planes of U.S. registry. Of the 8,000 airplanes, almost 7,000 already equipped or have been retrofitted to address the radio altimeter interference issue we talked about, and they've done this before January 11th of this year. So approximately 820 planes will require adding the RF filter. That's a cost of FAA estimates at $5,000 per airplane. But there are about 180 planes which will require a radio altimeter replacement for an FAA estimated cost of $80,000 per airplane. So for an airline that still has non-radio altimeter tolerant planes, the FAA has hinted that it will not be sympathetic to excuses the airline delays or that are based on inability to provide the radio altimeter compliant equipment where needed. So the question is, will the airlines be able to bring enough of these remaining approximately 1,000 aircraft online on or before the July 1st deadline? That's about 3 weeks from today, and to avoid major delays. Or will we see delays this summer if airlines run short of radio altimeter compliant aircraft? Flights canceled due to these kinds of issues, or the airline will announce it is an equipment issue, and that's what they'll tell you on their website or in the airport.
So, David, is this the same issue outside of the U.S.?
Globally, 5G is just starting to get off the ground, so to speak. Similar to the U.S., each country can regulate and assign spectrum as long as it conforms to the latest International Telecommunications Union rules. Outside the U.S., as an example, the U.K. has assigned 3.8 to 4.2 gigahertz for private 5G use. That is right against the 4.2 gigahertz used by radio altimeters with no guard band. As anyone who's flown in and out of an airport, there are many warehouses, trucking companies, and distribution centers very near the runways, and these companies will be one of the primary users of private 5G, most likely. So outdoor 5G antennas, can be bumped, misaligned, or potentially the signals can reflect off of metal objects in these types of facilities. In addition, Canada and other countries have assigned their 5G C-band up to 4.0 gigahertz, which is 20 megahertz higher than the U.S. allocation. So while each country is responsible to stringently mitigate interference to radio altimeters, it's something to carefully monitor, Joe.
All right, David, I guess we'll just have to wait and see, because I think we all know summer's a busy travel season. So hopefully there won't be any problems. Okay, Steve, it seems like after all these events and all this trauma, the situation has been successfully resolved.
So the situation is indeed much better than it was when we last met, assuming, and that is a big assumption, that the airlines have enough Group 4 aircraft to make it through the initial surge while they upgrade their Group 1 to 3 aircraft to make them radio altimeter tolerant. But there's still some loose ends at the FCC. First, it is unclear precisely what procedures the FCC will employ to require 5G carriers to continue their mitigation efforts. For the moment, carriers are making filings in the appropriate FCC dockets stating that they will comply with the same conditions agreed to by Verizon Wireless and AT&T as they launch their 5G services. But it's not clear what these voluntary commitments are as enforceable as changes to the FCC's rules to that effect, and it is also unclear who would enforce any violations, the FCC or the FAA. With that in mind, some have suggested that the FCC's rules should be amended to avoid any ambiguity. Second, the wireless carriers' voluntary mitigation efforts are scheduled to sunset on January 1st, 2028, at which point they will presumably resume full power operations near airports unless otherwise constrained. This 2028 full power date has caused concern in the aviation industry by raising the possibility of another costly and disruptive radio altimeter retrofit with an uncertain availability of radio altimeters sufficiently hardened for the new full power environment. And there's a larger issue of how we protect wireless safety of life devices from out-of-band emissions from other radio devices. All of this leaves a really full plate for the new FCC commissioner, Ana Gomez, who will presumably be confirmed by the Senate, and the yet-to-be-named new administrator of the FAA, who will replace the current acting administrator, Billy Nolan. Lucky them.
Steve, those are some really good points and probably something we can cover on another podcast, but unfortunately we are out of time today. So thank you, Steve, for helping out here today. And thank you as well, David. Now, clearly, there is work ahead for the communications industry and the airline industry. And as we've done, we'll keep you updated. In the meantime, if you do want to talk about other wireless needs, you can contact Steve, David, me, or any of our LB3 and TC2 colleagues by sending us an email or just give us a call. You can also stay up to date by subscribing to Staying Connected, by checking out our websites, and by following us on LinkedIn.